we're back here at the walk. Hopefully, you had a really good week this week as we get closer and closer to Christmas and the anticipation and the gift shopping and the decorating of our homes and the baking of cookies. Hopefully, you have enjoyed some of those celebrations. But I know that for some of us, sometimes Christmas brings a lot of sadness instead of celebration. So my prayer for you, if that is your case, that you will seek the Christ of Christmas, whether you're celebrating or whether you are sad. Let's center ourselves around the birth of Christ during this Christmas holiday. So last week I started by reading you a three-part series story that I wrote a couple of years ago. And it's just kind of a creative way to illustrate Christ's love for us. It's about a little girl named Sarah. And Sarah lived in the town of Bethlehem. In fact, her dad is the one that owned the inn. And as she was sitting outside playing, she saw the people coming through the town of Bethlehem. And when she did, she looked up and she saw this lady that had a baby in her stomach. And Sarah took the opportunity to go inside of her house to get an old clay jar and bring it out to Mary and to give her a drink of water. But when she did, she told Mary to hold on to that old clay jar because Mary might need it at some point. So today we're going to pick up the story about little Sarah, the old clay jar, and Mary and baby Jesus. As the morning peeked through the clouds, Sarah woke with a sense of urgency to find the woman and her husband. What if she needed something? What if they didn't find the stable? What if the baby had been born? As she put on her sandals, she knew that she should tell her family where she was going, but she also knew that her mother wouldn't let her go to the stable alone. So she slipped out the door, hoping to return before her family suspected that she was gone. Her little feet carried her as quickly as they could as she ran toward the old stable. As she turned the corner in the road, she could hear what sounded like a lamb crying out for its mother. As she approached closer to the stable, she realized it was not a lamb. It was a baby. In John chapter 1, verse 29, it says, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." Curious to see this baby, she snuck around to the side of the stable, peeking through a broken slat on the stable wall. As she peeked through, she saw the baby wrapped in an old cloth and lying in the wooden feed trough. Sarah stood still, watching the baby in awe. Looking through the broken slat, Sarah's scope of vision was limited. When she shifted in her view, she could see the woman Mary and her husband sitting next to the feeding trough, looking exhausted from the night. As Mary was resting in her husband's arms, she looked as though she had fallen asleep. Sarah knew she wanted to bring something to the new family, to the new baby. She could get a blanket for the baby or maybe one of her wooden blocks. How about some water? Water from the well. But she had nothing to carry the water in. As she peeked through the wooden slat, she saw the old clay jar that she had given Mary the day before. If she could only reach it without disturbing the family. As Sarah considered her best plan of approach, she quietly slid through the opening in the stable wall, grabbing the jar. Her plan was to get the water from the well, bring it back to Mary to drink. Once the jar was full, she would quietly set it in the stable entrance without disturbing the family. She quickly approached the well, filling the clay jar as full as she could and still able to carry it with her small arms. Balancing the heavy jar, she walked slowly back to the stable, being careful not to spill a drop. As she walked alongside the roadside, her heart grew full of excitement as she carried her gift. This was the perfect gift. When she entered the doorway of the stable, Mary and Joseph became startled, looking up at Sarah. Distracted by her embarrassment, Sarah lost her footing, catching her sandal on a small twig. When she stumbled, the clay jar lost its balance. Sarah watched in horror as the jar slipped out of her hands and tumbled to the ground. The weight of the water caused the jar to hit the ground with a crash, breaking it into several pieces. She could hardly open her eyes in fear as to what she would find. Her heart was broken as she saw her gift of water spilled amongst the broken pieces of the jar. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 28, it says, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Sarah bent down, picking up the pieces to her broken jar. As she gathered each piece, she placed them inside of her apron. Once the pieces were collected, she left the stable in a hurried embarrassment, escaping the shame she felt from her failed attempt to bring her gift to Mary, Joseph, and the baby. Broken-hearted, Sarah ran home. As she entered, the rooms were still quiet by the early morning. She was able to retreat to her room and close her door to the world. As she unwrapped her apron that held the pieces to her broken jar, a tear rolled from her eye. What was she going to do with this broken jar? Tempted to throw it away in hopes to forget this horrid memory, she reluctantly decided to keep the pieces. She gently laid the broken clay jar in a wooden box sitting by her bed. As she crawled under her bed, her tears began to flow like a dam opened on a river. Her heart was broken as her clay jar. As she laid on her bed, the tears turned into a quiet sob, not withholding her heart. Once her heart settled, she slid the wooden box under her bed in attempts to forget this heartache. Days passed since the child was born in the stable. Each day, she would slip from her house to get a glimpse of this child. As she stood outside of the stable, she would ask herself this question: what is it about this baby? One day, as Sarah was peeking through the wall, her heart sank. The baby was gone. Mary and Joseph were gone. She shifted her angle to see if maybe they had moved to another place in the stable, but as she looked around, she couldn't see them anywhere. She ran around to the front, looking in to see if she could find them. She only saw leftover rags that they had wrapped the baby in. Otherwise, the stable was empty. In John chapter 20, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She said, 'They have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him.'" With sadness in her heart, Sarah walked home, overwhelmed that the journey to the stable was over. She knew that she had to forget the moment when her jar broke and the water spilled out, her empty and broken jar. Join me next week as we'll continue in this story in our last and final episode of what happened to Sarah, what happened to that jar. So join me next week on The Walk.